The most fearsome man in the wilderness walked into town, looked through the crowd, and pointed directly at the woman the town had rejected, and said, "Her, only her." The square fell silent. People said he was mad. People said the girl wasn't worthy, but none of them knew what Rhett Blackstone had seen at first sight. This is the story of the woman the world cast aside, and the only man brave enough to choose her. Like, comment the name of the city you're watching, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss this journey. The stagecoach from Millhaven rolled into Dry Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, arriving 40 minutes late and trailing a plume of yellow dust that hung in the still air long after the wheels stopped turning. 3 passengers climbed down. A hardware merchant named Gus Pelletier, who immediately began arguing with the driver about a crate that had shifted during the journey. A widow named Mrs. Calhoun, who was met at the stop by her son-in-law with a cart and a perfunctory handshake. And then Eliza Hartwell, who stepped down last, set a worn leather suitcase on the ground beside her feet and looked up at the town that was supposed to be her fresh start. Dry Creek was not much to look at. A main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass if neither driver was prideful about it. A general store with a warped porch. A saloon called the Dented Spur, whose sign had been hanging crooked for so long that nobody noticed anymore. A barber shop, a livery stable, a post office that also served as the land registrar's office on alternating Thursdays. And dust. Dust on everything. The windowsills, the hitching posts, the hats of the men who stood outside the saloon watching the stagecoach unload with the mild proprietary interest of men who had nowhere else to be. Eliza was 28 years old. With dark hair she kept pinned back in a practical knot that made no concessions to fashion. She was not small. She had never been small, not since she was 12 years old, and it became clear to everyone, including herself, that her body had its own ideas about what shape a woman ought to be. She was broad-shouldered and full-figured, with strong hands and a way of planting her feet when she stood that suggested she was braced for something. She wore a gray wool dress that had been mended twice at the left cuff and a coat that had belonged to her mother. She carried 1 suitcase. That was all she had. She stood on the boardwalk outside the stage stop and took in the town, and the town, in its own quiet and merciless way, took her in return. The men outside the Dented Spur looked at her and looked away. That particular kind of dismissal, not hostile, just absent, as if she hadn't quite registered as worth cataloging, was something she had grown used to over the years. It still landed the same way it always had, somewhere just below the sternum, but she had learned not to let it show on her face. She picked up her suitcase and walked to the general store to ask about the boarding house. The woman who ran the boarding house was named Agnes Pyle, and she had the particular brand of flinty Christianity that expressed itself primarily through suspicion of other people's choices. She looked Eliza up and down when she appeared at the door, then looked at the suitcase, then back up at Eliza's face. "You the one answering the Hendersons' advertisement?" Agnes said. "No, ma'am. I'm looking for room and board. I was told you let rooms." "I do." Agnes's eyes did another circuit. "You have family here?" "No." "Employment?" "Not yet. I'm hoping to find work as a seamstress or a laundress. I have experience in both." Agnes made a sound that was not quite a word. "I'll need a week paid in advance, and I don't allow men visitors past 7 in the evening. I don't allow drinking on the premises, and Sunday mornings are quiet." "That's fine," Eliza said. Agnes let her in. The room was small and clean, with a single window that looked out onto a side alley, and a narrow bed with a quilt that had been washed so many times the pattern had gone soft. Eliza sat on the edge of the bed after Agnes left, set her suitcase on the floor, and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then she unpacked what she had: 3 dresses, a sewing kit in a tin box, her mother's hairbrush, a small amount of money she had carefully rationed across the journey, and went to sleep before dark. Within 4 days, she understood the shape of the problem. Dry Creek was the kind of town where information moved faster than weather. By the time Eliza had made her way to the general store twice, the seamstress already established in town had heard about her, and by the time she'd introduced herself at the laundry operation run out of the Halverson women's backyard, they'd heard about her too. Not about her specifically. Nobody knew her specifically. She was a stranger. But about the fact of her. A woman. Alone. No husband, no family. No explanation that made comfortable sense. The seamstress, whose name was Mrs. Delacroix, was polite in the way of someone who has already decided something. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't really have the need for another pair of hands right now." The Halverson women were less subtle. The elder of them, Marta, looked at Eliza in a way that made Eliza feel she was being weighed against a standard she hadn't been shown. "We take in laundry ourselves," Marta said, "from the families we know. We're not really looking to expand." Eliza thanked her and left. She tried the hotel, asking if they needed help with housekeeping. The manager, a thin-lipped man named Cordell, said they were fully staffed. She tried the doctor's office, asking if he needed a receptionist or someone to help with basic tasks. Dr. Ambrose was kind enough, but genuinely didn't have the means to hire anyone. She tried the school on the theory that perhaps the teacher needed an assistant for the younger children, but the school teacher was a married woman named Ruth Fairfield, whose husband was on the town council, and she looked at Eliza with a careful, measuring expression and said she'd have to ask her husband first, and then Eliza never heard back. She returned to Agnes Pyle's boarding house each evening to a supper eaten mostly in silence, served alongside two other boarders, a surveyor named Hatch, who was in Dry Creek on a contract job and spoke about 7 words total across any given meal, and a young man named Percy, who worked at the livery and had the social instincts of a fence post. Eliza ate, washed her dishes, and went upstairs. She was not naive. She understood what was happening. She had encountered versions of it before. The closed circle, the polite wall, the specific kind of exclusion that never announced itself directly. In a town this small, people were comfortable with what they knew, and what they knew about her was only what they could see. A woman alone, substantial in body, carrying no history they recognized. The absence of a history they could verify was, to certain minds, equivalent to a troubling history. And troubling histories were not welcome. What she had not yet encountered in Dry Creek was cruelty that put its name to itself. That arrived on the 5th day. She was walking back from the post office. She had written to her cousin in Abilene to ask if she knew of any work, a letter she'd composed carefully and kept deliberately without desperation, when she passed a group of women gathered outside the milliner's shop. 4 of them, dressed well, the wives of men who owned things. She recognized 2 of them from the boarding house suppers, women who had stopped by to visit Agnes. She nodded as she passed. She always nodded. It cost her nothing, and it was the right thing to do. One of them, a woman in a green dress whose name Eliza would later learn was Harriet Dunmore, waited until Eliza was 3 steps past, and then said, at a volume perfectly calibrated to reach Eliza's ears, without being quite loud enough to be an obvious confrontation, "I heard she came from Millhaven. You know what they say about the women who leave Millhaven." Eliza didn't stop walking. "Poor thing," said another voice with a warmth that was all surface. "She must have thought she could start over somewhere." A small, self-contained laugh, the kind that's designed to land like a stone. Eliza walked back to the boarding house. She went upstairs. She sat in the chair by the window, the one that faced the alley, and she sat there for a long time without doing anything, not crying. She'd learned that crying about things like this was something that happened to a younger version of herself, and that the current version didn't have the energy to spare. What she did eventually was take out her sewing kit and mend a fraying hem on her second-best dress. It gave her hands something to do. Her hands were good hands. She had always known that, even when she'd had difficulty knowing much else about herself with any confidence. The problem was she was running out of money, and Dry Creek was not going to let her in. She had been in town 11 days when she heard about Rhett Blackstone. She heard about him the way you hear about weather or geography, not from any single person, but gradually, the way information accumulates in a small town when something is always already understood. A reference here, a careful non-mention there. His name said with a particular lowering of the voice, not quite fear, but the caution that people use around things they respect the danger of. The outline of him that she assembled from these fragments was not entirely coherent. He was a mountain man who lived up in the Black Ridge Range to the north, in country that most people didn't attempt to navigate. He'd been up there for, nobody seemed to agree, somewhere between 8 and 15 years, building a homestead alone. He came down to town a few times a year for supplies. He was, by all accounts, large. He did not smile easily. He had, at some point in the past, stopped a dispute between two men outside the saloon by stepping between them and saying a single sentence that nobody present could afterward recall verbatim, but that had the immediate effect of both men deciding they no longer had a quarrel. "He's not right in the head," Percy mentioned at supper one evening, unprompted, which was unusual for Percy. "My boss says he once carried a full-grown mule 50 yards because the mule had a bad leg and the ground was rough." "That doesn't mean he's not right in the head," Eliza said. Percy considered this. "No," he admitted. "I guess not." The other thing people said about Rhett Blackstone, said it in the way you say something that's been said so long it's become a kind of local legend, was that he had not come down from the mountain seeking a wife in over a decade, and that this coming spring, word had it, he would. Eliza didn't think much about this. She had other concerns. 3 weeks into her time in Dry Creek, Agnes Pyle sat down across from her at the kitchen table one evening after supper, when the other boarders had gone up, and spoke with the directness of a woman who considered diplomacy a personal failing. "I'm going to be plain with you," Agnes said. "All right," Eliza said. "You're not finding work here." "I'm still trying." "I know you are." Agnes's voice was not without some rough species of sympathy. "But this town has decided about you, and once a town like this decides, it doesn't usually undecide. I've seen it before. You're alone, you're a stranger, and you don't fit what people here think a woman ought to look like. That's the whole of it, and I know it isn't fair, and fairness doesn't change it." Eliza looked at her hands, flat on the table. "What are you telling me, Mrs. Pyle?" "I'm telling you your week is up day after tomorrow, and I'll need the next week's payment. And I'm asking you honestly whether you have it." She didn't. She had enough for another 4 days, maybe 5 if she ate carefully. After that, there was nothing. "I'll find something," Eliza said. Agnes studied her. "There's one other thing that's worked for women in your situation," she said, and her voice went carefully neutral. "Not saying it's right or wrong, but the mail order arrangement has worked for some." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "I'm aware of it. There are men in this county and the next who've placed advertisements. Good men, some of them, lonely, up in the hills. It's not the worst thing." "No," Eliza agreed. "It's not the worst thing." She went upstairs and sat by the window for a long time. The alley was quiet. Someone had left an old barrel out there that was slowly rotting, and a lean yellow cat had taken to sitting on top of it in the evenings. Eliza watched the cat wash its face, methodical and entirely self-possessed. She was not opposed to marriage. She wasn't opposed to much of anything that might constitute a life. What she was, increasingly, was tired of the particular quality of hope that kept shrinking, kept adjusting its dimensions to fit smaller and smaller spaces. She had come to Dry Creek because it was far enough from Millhaven and what had happened in Millhaven that she thought she could be no one for a while, just a woman with capable hands and a willingness to work. She had not anticipated that being no one would prove quite this difficult. She did not make any decision that night. She just watched the cat until it got bored with the barrel and disappeared into the dark. The morning Rhett Blackstone rode into Dry Creek, Eliza was at the general store. She had gone to speak with the owner, a man named Tully Birch, because she had heard, through a chain of information that involved Percy mentioning it to Hatch, who mentioned it without apparent purpose at breakfast, that Tully was behind on his inventory counts and sometimes hired temporary help for that kind of work. It was not seamstressing, it was not laundry, but it was something. Tully was a heavy-set man with a red face and a generally pleasant disposition that had been somewhat eroded by 30 years of retail commerce. He was considering her proposition, or at least giving the impression of considering it, when the noise from outside changed. It was subtle, but in a small town you notice when the ambient noise shifts, the conversations on the street going quieter, the particular sound of a horse that isn't like other horses, heavier and more deliberate. Tully's eyes went to the window. "Well," he said, in a tone that combined mild alarm and the specific excitement of someone who knows a good story is about to occur. "That'd be Blackstone." Eliza looked out the window. The man on the horse was Large was too simple a word for it. He was built the way certain landscape features are built, with the sense that the proportions had been arrived at through necessity rather than accident. He sat the horse the way men sit horses when they've spent more time on horseback than not, easy and balanced, without show. He wore a dark coat that had seen considerable weather, and a hat pulled low enough that you couldn't immediately read his face. The horse beneath him was a gray that stood a full hand taller than anything else at the hitching posts and seemed entirely indifferent to being looked at. People had stopped on the street. Not obviously. They hadn't frozen or crowded, but they had found reasons to not be moving, to be checking on something near a doorway or stopping to retie something or suddenly needing to examine the quality of a porch railing. The attention of an entire street, arranged to look like inattention. "He's looking for a wife," Tully said, unnecessarily. "Word came down 3 days ago from Fenwick, who trades with him. Said Blackstone's ready to take a wife, said he'd be down to see about it." "You don't say," Eliza said, because she felt some response was required. She looked back at Rhett Blackstone on his gray horse, in the middle of the street where all the invisible attention was gathered, and then she looked away. She had her own concerns. "About the inventory work," she said. Tully pulled his attention back from the window. "Right, yes. I suppose I could use someone for a few days. End of the week. I can start tomorrow morning if you like." 50 cents a day. It wasn't generous. "All right," she said. What happened in the square that afternoon, Eliza did not witness directly. She heard it the way she heard most things in Dry Creek, in pieces, from different sources, each piece slightly different in its particulars. The shape of it, as she eventually assembled it, was this. Word had spread through town within an hour of Blackstone's arrival that he had indeed come down seeking a wife, and this created the particular social phenomenon that occurs in small frontier towns when a man with land and means makes his availability known, a subtle, competitive choreography of proximity. Women who were eligible, or whose families considered them eligible, found reasons to be in the vicinity of the square. Mothers found reasons to have their daughters nearby. The whole thing had the elaborate casualness of something very carefully arranged. Harriet Dunmore's daughter, Cecilia, was there. The Vasquez girl, Clara, who was considered the beauty of Dry Creek by a broad consensus. The eldest daughter of the man who owned the feed store. Her name was Bess. She was 17, sensible-looking. Several others. A representative sample of what the town considered its marriageable women, all of them better situated than Eliza Hartwell, all of them known, all of them with histories that could be vouched for. Rhett Blackstone had walked out to the square mid-afternoon, done some business at the feed store, and then stood for a while doing nothing in particular. People watching him said he looked at nothing and everything with the same equanimity, which they found unsettling. Then he turned and looked across the square, and he'd looked at Eliza Hartwell, who had come out of the general store to eat the lunch she'd brought, a piece of bread and some hard cheese sitting on the steps because the inside smelled like turpentine from some work Tully was doing at the back. She had not been there to be seen. She had been there because there was nowhere else to sit, and she was hungry. The accounts diverged here. Some said he walked directly to her. Some said he stood and looked for a full 2 minutes before he moved. Some said she looked back at him, and some said she didn't. What everyone who was present agreed on was that he crossed the square, stopped in front of her, and said something. What he said, Eliza would remember exactly, because it was not the kind of sentence you forget. He'd taken off his hat. That detail came from Clara Vasquez, who was standing close enough to observe it and reported it with a faintly wondering expression to the woman she told, as if it were unexpected. He'd said, "I'm Rhett Blackstone. I have land up in the Black Ridge, about 4 hours north of here. I came down because I'm looking for a wife, and I'd like to talk to you if you're willing." And Eliza, who was sitting on the steps of a general store eating bread and hard cheese, who had been in Dry Creek for 3 weeks and had encountered nothing but closed doors and careful cruelties, who had $11 left and a sewing kit in a tin box and a coat that had belonged to her mother. Eliza had looked at him for a long moment. "I'm Eliza Hartwell," she'd said. "I'm willing to talk." She told it to herself later, alone in her room, trying to be honest about it. She had not been swept away. She had not felt some sudden certainty, some recognition. He was a large stranger with a weathered face and serious eyes, and she had looked at him and thought, this might be something, or it might be nothing, But talking costs nothing, and I have run out of alternatives that don't require more of me than I have left. It was not a romantic accounting. She had never been good at the kind of self-deception that made things more romantic than they were. Her mother had called it a failing. Eliza had come to think of it as one of the few dependable things about herself. They talked for an hour, on the steps of the general store, while the town pretended not to watch. And then they moved to a table inside the store because Tully, recognizing an opportunity for commerce in proximity to conversation, offered them coffee, and they both accepted. Rhett Blackstone was not easy to talk to. He was not a man who used words casually or filled silence with sound out of social obligation. When she said something, he listened to it, actually listened, in the complete way that some people do, and most people only approximate. And when he responded, he said what he meant without ornamentation. "I won't pretend the life up there is easy," he told her. "It isn't. It's hard country, and the winters are hard. You'd need to learn things you don't know." "I'm capable of learning," she said. "I believe you are," he said, and said it in a way that made it clear he wasn't flattering her, just stating an assessment. "What are you looking for?" she asked him directly. "In a wife? What do you actually want?" He was quiet for a moment, not as though the question surprised him, but as though he was giving it the answer it deserved. "Someone who won't collapse when things go wrong," he said. "Someone I can talk to honestly, someone who can work and think. The rest of it, the details. Those work themselves out, or they don't." "And you looked at me," she said. "Specifically. There were other women in that square." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you were sitting there eating your lunch by yourself and not looking at me. Everyone else was arranged to be seen. You were just there." She thought about that. "That's not much to base a decision on." "It's not," he agreed. "That's why I came to talk to you." There was something in his directness that she found, she turned the word over carefully, steadying, not reassuring exactly, not comfortable, but solid, like a surface you could actually put weight on. "I need time to think," she said. "I'll be in town 3 more days," he said. "Take whatever time you need." But the reaction of Dry Creek to this development was swift, and Eliza found remarkably forthcoming with its opinions. Agnes Pyle, to her credit, said only, "He's got a good reputation for honesty, hard man, not cruel." Harriet Dunmore, who happened to be at the general store the following morning when Eliza came in for some thread, and learned somehow, through the town's uncanny social telegraph, that Eliza was apparently considering Blackstone's overture, said, with the crystalline smile of someone whose daughter had been standing in that square, "Of course, no one would blame you, dear, for taking what's offered. Not everyone can be particular." Eliza looked at her. "That's generous of you," she said, and went to find her thread. Clara Vasquez's mother stopped her on the street to express, with enormous warmth, her concerns about the isolation of mountain living and how difficult it must be for a woman without the support of a community, and how she hoped Eliza would think carefully. 3 men, all of them, as far as Eliza could determine, complete strangers to her, found reasons to mention to her, in different words but with the same general implication, that Rhett Blackstone was odd, and the mountain was hard, and she seemed like a sensible woman who deserved better than that kind of life. She listened to all of them with the same surface of polite attention, thanked them, and said nothing. What she did, on the afternoon of the second day, was go to find Rhett Blackstone. He was at the livery, seeing to his horse. She found him there, and he looked up when she came in, and she said without preamble, "I have some questions." "All right," he said. "Is the land legally yours? No disputes, no liens, no complications?" "It's mine free and clear. I have the papers." "How far is it from the nearest settlement?" 4 hours south to here, 2 hours east to a town called Fenwick, smaller than this. There's a trading post an hour north. Do you have enough provisions to manage a bad winter?" "I've managed 17 bad winters. Yes." "If I come up there and we find we can't get on, if it doesn't work, what happens?" He met her eyes. "I'd bring you back down. It's not a prison." She nodded slowly. "What do you know about me? From before I came here?" "Nothing," he said. "I don't know anything about you before 3 days ago. People here have made assumptions about why I came alone, about what kind of woman I am. You've probably heard some of it." "I've heard some of it," he said. I don't put much stock in what people assume. Why not? He looked at her with those serious, level eyes. Because I've been the subject of assumptions my whole life, and most of them have been wrong. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, All right, I'll go up with you. He nodded, as if this were information he was taking in and organizing, not a moment to make more of than it was. We'll leave day after tomorrow, early. You'll want sturdy boots if you have them. I have one pair, she said. They'll do. Seeing. She told Agnes that evening. Agnes looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression that was complicated and chose not to uncomplicate it. You've thought about it. I have. You're sure? Eliza was quiet for a moment. The yellow cat was visible through the window, back on its barrel. I'm sure I'm going, she said. I'm not sure about much else, but I've been not sure here for 3 weeks and that hasn't gone anywhere. Agnes snorted, which was as close to warmth as Agnes generally managed. He's a decent man. I've dealt with him when he comes in for supplies. He doesn't waste words, and he doesn't make promises he can't keep. I've seen men do worse. So have I, Eliza said. She spent the evening packing her suitcase with the same things she'd unpacked from it 3 weeks before. 3 dresses, the sewing kit, the hairbrush, the remaining money. She went through her possessions with the same practical eye she brought to everything, deciding what was necessary and what wasn't. She had always been good at this, at stripping things down to what was actually needed. It was a skill that had served her when she had nothing and had not particularly failed her when she had more. She was not frightened. That surprised her, a little. She thought she might be. But what she felt was something more like the specific relief of motion after a long stillness. Not certainty, not joy exactly, but the sensation of finally being on the move, headed somewhere, even if somewhere was unknown and hard, and 4 hours north through mountain country with a man she had spoken to for a combined total of perhaps 3 hours. She would find out what she was made of. She had suspected for most of her life that she was made of more than she'd been given the chance to demonstrate. She folded her gray wool dress, set it in the suitcase, and closed the latches. Outside, the yellow cat sat on its barrel and cleaned its face in the dark, entirely indifferent to all of it, which Eliza found, for some reason she couldn't have articulated, faintly comforting. The morning she left, she walked out of Agnes Pyle's boarding house with her suitcase and did not look back at the town. Rhett was at the end of the street with his gray horse and a second horse, a sturdy roan he'd arranged for her. He looked the same as he'd looked every time she'd seen him, composed, present, taking up a specific amount of space in the world without apology or display. Ready? He said. Yes, she said. And that was the whole of it. No fanfare, no crowd, nobody to see them off. Dry Creek continued its mourning around them, indifferent to their departure in the same way it had been indifferent to her arrival. She put her foot in the stirrup and pulled herself up, and the roan adjusted its weight beneath her, and Rhett turned his gray north toward the mountains, toward the high, cold country that she knew almost nothing about, and that was, for better or worse, what came next. She followed him out of town. The dust settled behind them. The trail north out of Dry Creek started wide enough, a wagon road that ran through flat scrubland, the kind of country that didn't ask much of you. By the second hour, it had narrowed to a horse path, and by the third, it had become something that was less a path than a persistent suggestion between trees. The mountains ahead had looked blue and distant from town. Up close, they were gray and steep and entirely serious about themselves. Eliza rode without complaint. Her back ached from the unfamiliar saddle, and the roan had a slightly uneven gait that meant she had to adjust her weight constantly to stay balanced. But these were manageable facts, not catastrophes. She had ridden before, though not recently and not on terrain like this, and she focused on the horse beneath her and the ground ahead and let everything else wait. Rhett rode ahead, not far, always within earshot, occasionally glancing back without making a production of it. He set a pace that was steady rather than fast, and he read the trail with the ease of someone who had done it so many times it had become a kind of breathing. He didn't talk much. She didn't need him to. They stopped at midday at a creek crossing to water the horses. The water was cold and clear, running fast over flat stones. Eliza got down, worked the stiffness out of her knees, and crouched at the bank to splash water on her face. The cold of it was a shock and then a relief. "How much further?" she said. "Hour and a half, maybe 2, Rhett said. He was letting the gray drink. "The last stretch is steep." "I noticed it doesn't get easier." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She looked at the creek for a moment, the way it moved with complete indifference to anything happening on its banks. "The people in town," she said, "they told me the mountain was no place for a woman." "People in town say a lot of things about the mountain," Rhett said. "Most of them haven't been up it." "What would you say?" "Honestly?" He was quiet for a beat, the kind of pause she was starting to recognize as him actually thinking rather than collecting himself. "I'd say it's hard and it's cold and things break and go wrong and there's nobody coming to help you. I'd say it's also the most honest place I've ever lived. The mountain doesn't pretend, it just is what it is." She thought about that. "I can work with honest," she said. He looked at her. Not a quick look, a real one. "I think you can," he said. The homestead appeared around a bend in the trail in the late afternoon, when the light had gone golden and long, and Eliza's first impression of it was not what she'd expected, though she realized afterward she hadn't known what to expect. It was a log cabin, solidly built. The logs fitted tight, chinked carefully, a stone chimney at one end that showed evidence of regular use. A covered porch ran along the front, narrow but functional. Behind the cabin there was a barn, smaller than the main structure but sound, and beyond that a cleared field, maybe 3 acres, fenced with split rails, a woodpile under an overhang, a well with a stone surround, a root cellar mounded into the hillside with a heavy door. It was not beautiful, it was not comfortable in any way she could immediately identify. Everything about it had been built for function, not meanly, but with the specific priorities of a man who lived alone in hard country and needed things that worked. The surrounding mountains pressed in close, the forest starting maybe 50 yards from the cabin walls, and the sky above was already darkening at its edges, the temperature dropping with the sun. She stood in the yard, holding the roan's reins, and looked at it all. "It's not much to look at," Rhett said from beside her. "It's solid," she said. "That matters more." Something in his posture shifted, not quite relief, but adjacent to it. "There's a second room off the back. I cleared it out. You'll have your own space until—" He stopped. "For as long as you need it." "Thank you," she said. She meant it practically, not sentimentally. He received it the same way. The first week was a process of learning the shape of things. The homestead ran on a rhythm that had been established over years of one man's habits, and Eliza didn't try to disrupt it so much as learn it first. She watched how Rhett moved through his mornings, which tasks came first, how he read the weather, when the animals needed tending. She asked questions when she had them, which was often, and she'd discovered that Rhett answered questions the same way he did everything else, directly, without condescension, without performing patience. "The well rope's fraying," she told him on the third morning, when she'd gone out early to draw water. He came to look at it. "I've been meaning to replace it. There's spare rope in the barn, second peg on the left." "I can do it," she said. He didn't tell her she couldn't. He said, "The splice on that type takes a particular knot. I'll show you once." He showed her once. She did it herself. That was the baseline between them, established without discussion. She wasn't a guest, and she wasn't helpless. And if she didn't know how to do something, she'd learn it. And if she needed to be shown, she'd ask. He seemed to have no difficulty with this. It occurred to her, observing him across that first week, that he was not a man who needed to be needed in the diminishing way. He wanted a partner. The concept seemed in his mind to mean what it actually said. It wasn't seamless. They were still strangers in the deep ways that matter, and the cabin was small and they were both people with their own ingrained rhythms, and there were moments of friction that had nothing to do with either of them being unreasonable. She liked to work in silence. He talked sometimes in the evenings, and when he did, it was directly about real things. The land, the weather, the history of the country up here, what he'd seen and learned. She talked back when she had something to say, and didn't when she didn't. He seemed to find this acceptable. She was not certain what she found it. Not terrible. Not what she'd feared. One evening, about 10 days in, she was mending the knee of a work pair of trousers, her own, she'd ruined them on a fence post, when he said, across the table where he was working on a piece of tack, "The Crow Ranch is south of here, down in the valley." She looked up. "I've heard the name." "Probably not the way it ought to be heard," he said. "Silas Crow runs about 4,000 acres and has been trying to add to that number for 15 years. He's made offers on this land twice." "And you didn't sell?" "And I didn't sell." He turned the leather over in his hands. He didn't like that much. "What does that mean practically?" Rhett was quiet for a moment. "It means he's patient, and he has money, and men who work for him who do things he doesn't have to put his name to. It means I've had fences cut, and equipment gone missing, and a water diversion upstream that I had to rebuild. Nothing I could prove came from him specifically." She thought about this. "Why are you telling me now?" He looked at her across the table. "Because you should know what you've come into. I should have told you before you agreed to come, and I didn't, because I wasn't sure how much of a problem it was going to be. I'm telling you now because I think it's going to be more of a problem." "What changed?" "You," he said simply. "Crow hears everything that happens in this county. He'll know I came down and brought someone back. He'll see that differently than me up here alone." She set down her mending. "He'll see it as a weakness. He'll see it as something to use," Rhett said. "Which isn't the same thing, but isn't better." She looked at him steadily. "Are you regretting it? Bringing me up here?" "No," he said, without any hesitation that would have made it a reassurance rather than a fact. "I'm making sure you have the whole picture." She picked her mending back up. "All right," she said. "Now I have it." What she hadn't anticipated, and what surprised her more than the hard work, or the cold, or the particular daily challenges of living at altitude with inadequate supplies, was the land itself. She had grown up in small towns. She understood towns, their textures, their economies, the way they organized people into understandable categories. She did not have a framework for this, for waking up in the morning and walking out the cabin door into a silence so complete it seemed to have physical substance, for the quality of the air up here that tasted different from anything she'd known, for the mountains that rose on three sides, and the valley visible to the south, and the sky that at night was a quantity of stars she had no reference point for. It didn't make her sentimental. It didn't produce in her some spiritual revelation. What it did, gradually and without announcement, was recalibrate something. Her sense of scale, maybe. The things that had felt enormous in Dry Creek, the whispers, the closed doors, Harriet Dunmore's calibrated cruelties, didn't disappear, but they took their actual size, which was smaller than she'd been carrying them. She was not going to tell Rhett any of this. She barely had words for it herself. What she told him, 3 weeks in, on a Saturday afternoon when they'd finished splitting wood and were sitting on the porch with coffee because there was nothing pressing for the next hour. "I was engaged once, in Mill Haven, before I came to Dry Creek." He looked at her, not with surprise exactly, but with the attention he gave everything. "What happened?" "He decided I was too much trouble," she said. "His family didn't approve. He was practical about it." She drank her coffee. It was the word he used, practical. Rhett was quiet for a moment. "And that's what they were saying in Dry Creek, about you coming from Mill Haven. They were saying a woman who was left must have deserved it." She said it flatly, not bitterly, just as a statement of what it was. "That's the arithmetic people do." "That's a stupid arithmetic," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." She looked out at the tree line. The afternoon light was doing something complicated with the tops of the pines, turning them a color that had no word she knew for it. "My father called me useless once," Rhett said abruptly, in a tone that suggested he didn't say it often. "I was 14. I'd made a mess of a harness repair, and he looked at it and used that word, useless." He paused. "I left home when I was 17. I came up here when I was 23. I built this." He said it without pride, just fact. "Took me a long time to stop hearing that word." She looked at him. He was looking at the tree line, the same direction she'd been looking. "Do you still hear it?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said, "less than I used to." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that accumulates meaning, the kind that means something has passed between two people that doesn't need to be elaborated on. She had not expected this. She'd expected the hard work and the cold and the difficulty of learning a new life. She had not expected someone who would, without performance or strategy, simply tell her a true thing in exchange for a true thing, as if honesty were just the currency they were both most comfortable dealing in. She did not let herself think too far ahead. She had learned, across years of things not going the way she'd planned, that thinking too far ahead was expensive. But she sat there on the porch of a mountain homestead in the last of the afternoon light and thought, this might become something real. She didn't say that. She finished her coffee. The north fence needs attention, she said. I noticed a section this morning where the rails are working loose. I'll get to it tomorrow, he said. I can help, she said. If you show me how? He looked at her with what might have been, in someone else, a smile. On Rhett Blackstone's face, it was more like a very slight easing. All right, he said. I'll show you. She set her empty cup down on the porch railing and went inside to start on supper, and the mountains held their positions around the homestead, indifferent and enormous, and the sky began its slow lean toward dark. The first real snow came in early November, 3 weeks earlier than Rhett had seen it arrive in any of his 17 years on the mountain. It came overnight without much warning. The sky had been doing something strange at sunset, a particular yellow-gray that Rhett said meant weather, but not necessarily this. And by morning there were 8 inches on the ground, and more falling in the heavy, purposeful way that meant it wasn't finished. Eliza stood at the cabin door and looked at it. She had known, intellectually, that winter up here would be different from anything she'd experienced. Knowing it and standing in the door of a log cabin 4 hours from the nearest town while the world disappeared under white were 2 different categories of understanding. It'll ease by afternoon, Rhett said from behind her. He was already pulling on his coat. But we need to check the barn roof. There's a weak section on the north side I was going to reinforce last month and didn't get to. I'll come, she said. You don't have to, I'll come, she said again, and went to get her coat. The barn roof held. The weak section had bowed under the weight of the snow but not given, and they spent an hour clearing it from the outside with a long-handled rake Rhett had built for exactly this purpose, working without much conversation because the wind made conversation effortful and because there wasn't much to say beyond what the task required. By the time they came back inside, Eliza's hands had gone from cold to painful to a deep, bone-level ache that took most of an hour by the stove to fully resolve. She did not complain about this. She noted it as information. She would need better gloves before the real cold came, and she would need to build up more tolerance than she currently had. These were solvable problems. What happened 2 days after the snow, though, was not a solvable problem. Not easily. Rhett had gone out at first light to check the water diversion upstream, the one he'd mentioned to Eliza, the repair he'd made after someone had tampered with it the previous year. He was gone longer than she expected, and when he came back, his expression had a quality she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger exactly, something older and colder than anger. The diversion's been broken again, he said. Not by weather. Someone took a pick to it. Eliza set down what she was doing. When? Recent. Before the snow, maybe just before, which means it was planned. Whoever did it knew the snow would make it harder to find and harder to fix. He was standing in the middle of the room, still in his coat, tracking mud on the floor without noticing. If I don't get water flowing to the lower field again before a hard freeze, I lose the root garden. Everything we have stored in the ground. She thought about the root cellar, the careful inventory she'd done with him 2 weeks ago. The potatoes, the turnips, the carrots, the beets. A significant portion of what they would eat between now and spring. Can it be fixed? She said. Yes. It'll take 2 days of work and cold I don't love working in, and I'll need to bring up some materials from the barn. He finally noticed his coat was still on and took it off with a short, controlled movement. This is Crow. You know that? I know it the way I know it every time, he said. Nothing I can prove to anyone who isn't already inclined to believe me. This was, she had learned, the particular cruelty of Silas Crow's method. He operated always at exactly the distance from provable that kept him safe. Equipment that went missing could have been misplaced. Fences that got cut could have been done by any number of people or even by weather. A water diversion that got broken could have been an accident or vandalism by parties unknown. The cumulative weight of it was obvious to anyone paying attention, but individual incidents were all deniable, and Crow knew every judge and land official in the county well enough to use his first name. Rhett fixed the diversion. It took him 2.5 days in weather that got worse on the second day, and Eliza worked alongside him for as much of it as she was capable of, which was most of it. She was slower and less practiced, but she was there, handing materials, holding things in place, doing what he directed without making him direct her twice. Her hands were ruined by the end of it. She didn't say so. The root garden survived. Barely. Silas Crow came to the homestead himself in the second week of November, which Rhett said was unusual. He typically sent men. The fact that he came himself meant something, though Rhett was careful about saying what. Eliza saw him from the window before Rhett did. She was inside. Rhett was in the barn, and she took a moment to look at him before going out. He rode a good horse, a dark bay that moved with the expensive ease of an animal well cared for. He was perhaps 60, with a lean, weathered face and eyes that sat deep under heavy brows. He was well dressed for a ranch call, which itself was a statement. His 2 men hung back a careful distance behind him, positioned the way men position themselves when they're being paid to be available. She went to the barn door. "Rhett, someone coming." He came out and looked, and his face went through something she'd only seen it do once before, that particular stillness that meant he was managing something he felt strongly about. "Stay inside," he said. "No," she said pleasantly. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He turned back toward the yard. Crow pulled his horse up at the edge of the cleared area, which was as far as courtesy required, and no further. He looked at Rhett, then at Eliza, then back at Rhett. "Blackstone," he said. His voice was the kind of voice that was accustomed to being the one speaking. "I heard you took a wife." "That's right," Rhett said. Crow's eyes went to Eliza again, slower this time, with the assessing quality of a man pricing livestock. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was technically courtesy and actually something else entirely. "Mr. Crow," she said. She'd asked Rhett his name when she was watching from the window, and Rhett had confirmed it in one word on their way to the yard. Crow looked back at Rhett. "I came because I like to handle things directly when I can," he said, in a tone that suggested he knew the irony of this and didn't care. "You and I have had an uncomfortable situation between us for a while now." "We have," Rhett said. "I've made you fair offers for this land, 3 times. "Twice," Rhett said. "The third one wasn't fair." A pause. Crow's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "The valley's changing, Blackstone. There's going to be a rail spur through this county inside of 3 years. Land up here in the Black Ridge is going to be worth considerably more than it is now, and the men positioned to profit from that are the men with enough acreage to matter. A small homestead up a mountain trail isn't going to be viable." "It's been viable for 17 years, Rhett said. "Things change." "They do," Rhett agreed, with a flatness that was its own answer. Crow let a moment pass, the kind of moment that's a calculation rather than a pause. Then he looked at Eliza again, and this time there was something in the look that made her want to stand up straighter, which she did. "Must be a hard life for a woman up here," he said. "Isolated, no neighbors, no community." He said community the way you'd say a word in a language you didn't speak. "A woman usually wants more than this." "I find I manage," Eliza said. "I'm sure you do." He held her eyes a beat longer than necessary, then looked back at Rhett. "I'll make you one more offer, better than the last. You take it, you walk away with enough to start somewhere easier, somewhere with a town nearby and people around you." The implication of you both was heavy in the air. Think about your wife, if nothing else. Rhett was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice hadn't changed in volume or temperature, but it had a quality to it that Eliza hadn't heard before. Something bedrock and absolute. "This is my land," he said. "It was my land before you started wanting it, and it'll be my land after. There's no number you can put on it. You can ride back down." Crow looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse, unhurried, and rode back down the trail, his men falling in behind him. Eliza and Rhett stood in the yard and watched him go. "He won't stop," she said. "No," Rhett said. "He won't." What followed was a particular kind of siege, the quiet kind, the kind designed to exhaust rather than overwhelm. A section of fence on the east boundary, cut clean through. One of the barn's small windows, broken, not by weather, by a rock. A trap set on the north trail, the kind used for large animals, positioned where a horse would step into it in low light. Rhett found it before either of the horses did, barely. Each incident was small enough to explain away. Accumulated, they were a sustained message. Rhett absorbed it with a grimness that she recognized as controlled. He was not a man who scared easily. She'd come to understand that about him in the weeks they'd lived side by side. But he was also not a man who miscounted threats. He took the trap up to the barn and set it on the workbench and stood looking at it for a while. "If one of the horses had hit that in the dark," Eliza said from the doorway. "I know," he said. "This isn't just harassment anymore." "No," he said, "it's not." She thought about what she knew of Silas Crow, which was assembled from Rhett's careful accounts, and a few additional pieces she'd gotten from the trading post operator, a talkative man named Selby, when she and Rhett had ridden down in October for supplies. Crow had been building his ranch empire for 30 years. He'd started small, a family operation, and had expanded through a combination of legal land purchases and methods that existed in the gap between legal and not. 3 families that Selby knew of had sold to him under various pressures. One of them hadn't sold, a man named Garrett who ran sheep on the eastern slope, and Garrett had had a bad run of luck across 18 months that ended with him taking Crow's offer at a figure well below what the land was worth. Crow was methodical. He was patient. He had money, which meant he had time, which meant he could keep doing small things indefinitely until the accumulated weight of small things broke you. "He thinks I'm your weakness," Eliza said. She'd been thinking it since the day he rode up, since the way he'd looked at her. Rhett turned from the trap. "He's wrong. He thinks bringing me here was you softening, getting comfortable, that I'm something he can threaten or use." She said it plainly, working through it. "If I weren't here, this would still be happening. But he'd be applying pressure on you differently. The way he's doing it now is designed to make you worry about me." Rhett looked at her steadily. "Are you telling me you think you should leave?" "No," she said. "I'm telling you he's miscalculated what kind of person I am." Something in his face shifted. Not relief, exactly, but something in that direction. "We need to be smarter than reacting," she said. "Every time something happens, we fix it, and that's good. But we're playing the game by his rules. He does a thing, we respond. He controls the pace." "What do you suggest?" She leaned against the barn door frame and thought about it honestly, not performing certainty she didn't have. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "I need to understand the land better. The ravines north of here, the cliff country. You've mentioned it, but I haven't been up that way." "It's rough country," he said. "Will you take me up there?" He looked at her for a moment. "Why?" "Because I want to know what we have," she said. "All of it, not just the homestead, the whole terrain." He was quiet for a beat. "Tomorrow," he said, "if the weather holds." The storm that changed everything arrived on a Thursday night in the 3rd week of November, and it came with the specific violence of mountain weather that has been building pressure for days before it releases. The wind came first, hard enough to rattle the cabin shutters in a way that wasn't rattling so much as flexing, the whole structure breathing against the force of it. Then the snow. Not the soft accumulating kind, but the driven horizontal kind that found every gap. Rhett was up twice in the night checking the barn, and Eliza was up both times with him, because sleeping through the sound of that wind was not something either of them managed. By the early morning hours, the storm had peaked and then continued, steady and cold and unrelenting, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, they were both simply awake in the main room, the stove going, sitting with coffee, because it was better than lying in the dark listening to the wind argue with the roof. "Crow's men won't be out in this," Rhett said. "No," she said, "but they'll be out after. When the weather clears, there'll be a day or two of hard cold before it eases. If they're going to do something significant, that's when they do it." when we're already worn down from the storm and conditions are bad enough that help is far away. She held her cup and thought about the ravine country she'd seen with him 2 days before. The frozen creek beds, the unstable shelves of shale above the North Trail, the natural narrowing of the passage between two rock faces that meant anyone coming through it had to come in single file and couldn't see what was on the other side until they were already through. She had filed all of it away carefully. She'd been filing things away for weeks, building a picture she didn't have a use for yet, but that she'd known, with a certainty she couldn't entirely explain, she would need. "I've been thinking about the North Passage," she said. Rhett looked at her across the stove. "If someone were coming up that trail in the dark, in hard cold after a storm," she said slowly, "and they didn't know the terrain the way we know it." "Eliza," his voice was careful. "I'm not talking about anything that hurts someone," she said. "I'm talking about using what we have. The terrain is ours. We know it, and they don't. That's an advantage we're not using." He was quiet, listening. The wind had dropped slightly, the storm settling into its long middle phase, still heavy, but no longer trying to tear the roof off. "The shale shelf above the North Passage," she said. "In a hard freeze after snow, that shelf is going to be carrying a lot of weight. If someone were to disturb it from the right position, it would come down," he said. "It would come down," she agreed, "across the trail, not on anyone, just across it." He looked at her for a long time. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since the trap," she said. "Since you found that trap in the trail." Outside, the storm pushed against the cabin walls, and the fire in the stove did what fires do in situations like this. It held its ground, steady and orange, making its small bright case against the dark and the cold. Rhett set down his coffee cup. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said, and she did. The storm broke on a Friday morning, leaving behind a silence so complete it had texture. 2 feet of snow on the flat ground, more in the drifts against the north wall of the cabin. The sky had gone the hard, brilliant blue that follows big weather in mountain country, the kind of blue that looks beautiful and means brutal cold. Rhett checked the thermometer he kept nailed to the porch post and said nothing, which told Eliza it was bad. "How cold?" she said. 15 below? Near enough," he said. She absorbed this. "They'll come today or tomorrow," she said, "before it warms." "That's what I think, too." They had spent the last 2 days of the storm, the long, loud middle of it when going outside was genuinely dangerous, working out every detail of what Eliza had proposed. Not quickly, not with the excitement of people who'd never done something difficult, but carefully, the way you plan something when the cost of getting it wrong is not abstract. They'd drawn the North Passage in the ash at the edge of the fire. They'd argued about 2 specific details, genuinely argued, Eliza holding her position on the timing and Rhett holding his on the positioning, and they'd arrived at a version that incorporated both and was better than either had been alone. There was one piece of it that Rhett hadn't wanted to accept. "You need to be at the shale shelf," Eliza had said, on the second night of the storm. "You're the one who knows exactly how much force it needs and where. I can't do that part." "Which means you're on the trail," he said. "Below the passage, in their line of sight." "Briefly," she said. "Eliza?" "I'm the one who draws them in," she said. "That's the whole plan. If they come up and find nothing, they go to the homestead and burn it. If they see me on the trail, a woman, alone, no sign of you, they think they have an easy situation. They follow me in. That's the variable we can control. Everything else depends on that." He had looked at her across the fire with an expression that was complicated in ways she didn't try to interpret. "I don't like it," he said. "I know," she said. "It's still the right plan." He'd been quiet for a long time, then, "The moment the shelf comes down, you go left, hard left, into the rock overhang. You stay there until I come down." "All right," she said. "I mean it. You don't wait to see what's happened. You go left and you stay there." "I understand," she said. He looked at her a moment longer. "You're not frightened," he said. It wasn't entirely a question. She thought about answering honestly, which she always tried to do with him. "I am," she said. "I'm just not letting it make my decisions." They came on Saturday morning, just after first light. Eliza knew before she saw them. There was a quality to the silence that changed, a specific absence where there should have been the ordinary sounds of morning, the birds that had learned the homestead's rhythm, the small settling noises of the mountain waking up. That absence was its own sound, and she'd been listening for it. She was already at the window, four of them, coming up the south trail on horseback, moving carefully through the snow. She recognized the two who had ridden with Crow on his visit. The other two she hadn't seen before, which meant Crow had added men, which meant he'd planned this as a finishing operation, not a harassment. She turned from the window. Rhett was already there, coat on, reading her face. "4," she said. "2 of his regulars, 2 I haven't seen." He nodded once. He'd been ready since before she woke. "Give me 20 minutes to get up to the shelf. Then you go out." 20 minutes, she said. He looked at her in the particular way he'd developed over the weeks they'd been living side by side. Not soft exactly, not the kind of look that was trying to say something it couldn't say aloud, just direct and real, the way he looked at everything that mattered to him. "Left," he said. "Hard left." "Hard left," she agreed. He went out the back. She stood in the cabin and counted time by her own pulse, which was faster than usual but not unmanageable. She put on her coat and her better gloves, the ones Rhett had brought back from the trading post after the incident with the diversion, when he'd noticed without saying anything that her hands had been damaged by the cold. She'd found them on the table one morning with no comment, and she hadn't made one either, just put them on. They were good gloves. She was glad of them now. At 19 minutes, she opened the cabin door and walked out into the cold. The plan required her to be visible on the North Trail, not running, not hiding, just moving, as if she were going to do some ordinary task and hadn't yet registered that there were 4 men coming up behind her. The performance was a simple one, but simple wasn't easy. The cold was real. The snow was real. And the sound of horses behind her, which she heard at approximately the 2-minute mark, was very real. She did not turn around immediately. She kept walking, kept her pace deliberate, counted to 5 after she heard them before she let herself glance back over her shoulder. They had seen her. 2 of them had urged their horses forward into a faster walk, not quite rushing, but closing distance. The other 2 hung back, and this told her something useful about their intentions. They were watching for Rhett, covering the possibility of an ambush, which meant they weren't completely reckless, and she needed to be careful about the timing. She turned forward and kept walking, up the trail, into the narrowing where the rock faces came close on either side. The entrance to the North Passage. Behind her, she heard one of them say something to the others, low enough that she couldn't make out words. Then the sound of hoofbeats on packed snow, coming faster. The passage was narrow. She went through it at a walk, feeling the rock faces close in on either side, the sky narrowing above her to a strip of that hard blue. The shale shelf was above and ahead, on the right side, where the rock face leaned slightly outward and had caught 15 years of weather and the accumulated weight of 2 feet of new snow. She didn't look up at it. She kept her eyes forward. She heard them enter the passage behind her. She counted steps. Rhett had been precise about the count. From the mouth of the passage to the point where the shelf's fall would cover the trail completely was 42 steps at a normal walking pace. She was at 26, 27, 28. One of the men behind her called out, "Hey, woman, stop!" She didn't stop. 32, 33. "I said stop." Closer now. The horse's breath loud in the confined space. 38, 39, 40. She went left, hard left, into the rock overhang, pressing herself flat against the cold stone, and she closed her eyes for the half second before it happened because Rhett had told her the sound would be. The shelf came down. The sound was not loud exactly. It was enormous. There's a difference. It was the sound of a significant portion of mountain rearranging itself, a grinding, concussive crack followed by the heavy cascading thunder of shale and packed snow, and ice coming off the rock face and across the trail, in a mass that shook the ground under her feet, even pressed into the overhang 10 yards away. A horse screamed, men were shouting, then a second, smaller fall, the shelf settling, and then an echoing silence that rang in her ears. She stayed where she was. She did not look out. Rhett had said to stay, and she stayed. She heard scrambling, voices closer than she'd expected. One of the men who'd hung back at the passage entrance, she thought. The ones covering against ambush, now dealing with the fact that their path was blocked, and two of their number were on the wrong side of a ton of fallen rock and ice. The words coming through were profane and fragmented, the kind of talk that happens when a plan has gone wrong and nobody's caught up yet. Then Rhett's voice, from above and to the right, from the high side of the rock face, carrying in the cold air with the quality of something that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. Your men are all right. Horses might be shaken. The trail's blocked and it'll stay blocked until spring thaw. You can ride back down and tell Crow this mountain is not his, or you can wait up here until you freeze. Those are the options I'm offering. A silence. Who are you? One of the men below called up. You know who I am? Rhett said. Now, ride back. Another silence, shorter. Then the sound of horses being turned, the creak of saddle leather, hoofbeats moving away. Eliza let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like a very long time. Ta-ta! Rhett came down off the rock face by a route she couldn't have managed without help, arriving at the overhang from the side rather than above. He was covered in snow and there was a cut on his right hand from the shale, bleeding through his glove, which he didn't appear to have noticed. You're bleeding, she said. He looked at his hand. I know, he said. You all right? Yes. She was. She took inventory, cold, shaky in the legs, in a way she was going to feel for a while, ears still ringing, hands clenched so tight in the gloves that her fingers had cramped. Yes, she said again more accurately. He looked at her for a moment, then looked at the blocked trail, the massive sprawl of shale and snow and ice that now filled the passage from wall to wall. That'll hold, he said. And the two men on this side? Spooked but not hurt. They're on foot. Horses panicked and ran back through before the second fall. They'll follow the horses down. He looked back at her. We need to get to Fenwick. She understood immediately. Today. Today. Before Crow regroups and before those men get back to him with a story that's only his version. He was already thinking ahead, working it through. Selby at the trading post knows people. He's had his own problems with Crow. Land pressure on his eastern border 2 years back. If we bring him what we have... What do we have? She said. Specifically. More than I told you, he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him carefully. Come back to the cabin first. There's something I need to show you. Yes. What he showed her was a tin box he'd kept under the floorboard beneath the woodpile, in a space she hadn't known was there. Inside the box were papers. Not many, but specific. A letter from the land registry at the county seat, dated 2 years prior, showing that Crow had filed a fraudulent boundary claim that overlapped with Rhett's legal deed. The clerk who'd filed it, a man named Aldous Webb, had since died, but the discrepancy between Crow's filing and the original survey remained in the record if someone looked for it. There was also a signed statement from a man named Garrett, the sheep rancher Selby had mentioned, the one who'd eventually sold to Crow under pressure, detailing specific threats that had been made against him. And there were 2 letters from Crow himself, written to Rhett over the years, worded carefully, but not carefully enough, that implied knowledge of events Crow couldn't have had without directing them. Eliza went through them slowly, reading each one, setting them in order. Why didn't you use these before? She said. Because the judge in this county is Crow's man, Rhett said. Showing these here gets them buried or gets me into a legal fight I can't afford to finish. I needed someone outside the county. I've been waiting for a reason to go that far. She looked up from the papers. And now you have one. And now I have 2 men who just came up here and tried to burn us out, who will be telling Crow a story that'll require him to do something more visible than he's done before. He paused. When Crow does something visible, he makes mistakes. He's not used to being pushed. Fenwick won't be far enough, she said. You need the circuit judge, the one who rides the Northern Territory. I know. Selby will know when he's due through, she said. She was arranging it in her mind, the sequence of it. And if we can get Garrett's testimony in person, does he still live near Crow's eastern border? Last I heard. Then he needs to know what happened today. He needs to know Crow's going further than harassment. She looked at the papers again. These are enough to open an inquiry. They're not enough to finish one. We need Garrett willing to stand in front of someone official and say what he signed here. Rhett was watching her. You've thought about this kind of thing before, he said. Not a question. I've been poor and alone, she said. When you're poor and alone, you learn quickly that the only reliable tool you have is information and who you can get it to. She set the papers down. When do you want to leave? 2 hours. I want to board up the cabin and get the horses fed and watered properly before we go. It'll be an overnight to Fenwick in this cold. She was already moving to start on her share of the 2 hours. Then we'd better start, she said. They arrived in Fenwick after dark, cold to the depth of themselves, the horses worn down and badly in need of the stable. Selby was still up. He seemed to always be up. A man with an insomniac's relationship to nighttime and a storekeeper's instinct for the significance of visitors arriving after dark in winter. He took one look at them on his doorstep and stood back to let them in. Blackstone, he said, and this must be your wife. Eliza, she said. Selby. He shook her hand with a directness she appreciated. You look like you've had a week in one day. Come in. There's a fire. They sat by it and Rhett laid out what had happened in a flat, ordered account, and Selby listened the way men who have been paying attention to something for a long time listen, nodding in the places that confirmed things he'd already suspected, going still in the places that were new. When Rhett finished, Selby looked at the papers Eliza set on the table and went through them with the same careful attention. Webb's filing, he said when he got to the registry letter. I knew there was something wrong with that boundary. 2 years I've known it. Can you get word to Garrett? Rhett said. I can, Selby said. He's not far, and I'll tell you something. He's been wanting a reason to stop running from Crow's shadow for 2 years. He might be more willing than you think. He looked at Eliza. The circuit judge, Harding, comes through the Northern Territory in late January. 6 weeks, maybe 7. Can we get to him before that? She said. Or get word to him? I can send a letter with the mail rider. Harding's a particular man. He doesn't like land fraud, and he doesn't like people who use distance as a shield. If I write it right, he might move his schedule. Write it right, Eliza said. Tell him exactly what happened today. Name the men. Name Crow. Selby looked at her with an expression of mild surprise that had some respect in it. Yes, ma'am, he said. They stayed the night at Selby's trading post, in the spare room above the store that smelled like dried goods and old wood. Eliza lay in the narrow bed in the dark, listening to the cold settle around the building, and thought about the long shape of what was still ahead. Crow wasn't finished. He was cornered now, maybe, more than he'd been, but a cornered man with money and patience and long-standing local influence was not a defeated one. There would be more before there was an ending. But there were papers in a tin box. There was Garrett's statement. There was Selby writing a letter tonight by lamplight. There was a circuit judge who hated land fraud somewhere in the Northern Territory who was going to hear about what happened on this mountain. She had come to Dry Creek with $11, a sewing kit, and a coat that had belonged to her mother. She had come to this homestead with one suitcase and no certainty about anything. She was still not certain about most things. But she was here, still here. And the woman who'd been sitting on a general store step eating bread and hard cheese, waiting to be told she wasn't enough, that woman had led 4 of Silas Crow's men into a mountain pass and come out the other side. She pulled the blanket up around her shoulders and closed her eyes. Outside, the cold held the mountain country in its fist, patient and absolute, and 6 weeks away a circuit judge named Harding was sleeping somewhere he didn't yet know he'd be leaving sooner than planned. Selby's letter reached Judge Harding in 11 days, which was faster than anyone had expected and slower than Eliza would have liked. The waiting was its own kind of work. Not passive, not the helpless variety, but the grinding, watchful kind where you keep doing what needs doing while keeping one eye on the trail south for signs of what Crow might do next. He did things. Of course he did. 4 days after the incident at the passage, 2 men Rhett didn't recognize rode up to the tree line south of the homestead and sat there for 20 minutes before turning back. Not a threat exactly, a reminder. Crow letting them know he was still counting, still patient, still there. A week after that, word came through Selby, who had appointed himself a kind of informal intelligence operation, partly out of genuine solidarity and partly because, as he told Rhett plainly, he'd been wanting to see Crow get the sharp end of something for years, that Crow had been in to see the county judge, a man named Fetter. and that whatever had passed between them had left Feder looking uncomfortable in the way of a man being asked to do something he knew was wrong but hadn't yet decided he wouldn't do. Feder's been in Crow's pocket for years, Rhett said when he told Eliza this. But he's not entirely without sense. He knows what a federal inquiry looks like when it arrives. And Harding's federal, Eliza said. Harding's federal, Rhett confirmed. They were in the cabin, the fire going, the short midwinter days making the evenings long. Eliza had taken to keeping a written account, not formally, just a lined notebook she'd found in Rhett's supplies, dates and events, what happened and when and who was present. It had been her idea. If this came before a judge, the existence of a contemporaneous written record was worth more than memory. Rhett had looked at the notebook the first time she showed it to him and said, "I should have thought of that years ago." "You were alone years ago," she said. "It's harder to document things when you're the only witness." But Garrett came to Fenwick in the second week of December. Eliza had not known what to expect of him. Rhett had described him as a tough man broken by pressure, and she'd formed an image from that description that turned out to be partly wrong. He was tough, yes. A compact, weathered man in his mid-50s with hands that had done every kind of hard work and eyes that had seen more difficulty than they'd made peace with. But he wasn't broken. He was something more specific than broken. He was a man who had been living with a decision he hated, a decision made under duress that he'd been unable to undo, and the weight of it had become its own kind of endurance. He sat across from Eliza and Rhett at Selby's back table and went through what he'd signed, the statement, verifying every line of it while Selby and Rhett listened and Eliza asked the specific questions. "You said here that Crow's man, Duval, is that the name, came to your property twice before the fire," she said, "both times after you declined Crow's offer." "That's right," Garrett said. "Same man both times. Big fellow, scar below his left ear. He didn't say anything threatening directly, first visit. Just looked around. Commented on how remote we were. Said something about how a fire could travel fast up in the hills before anyone knew about it. And then there was a fire," Eliza said. Garrett looked at his hands. "Barn went up 3 weeks after the second visit. Lost 4 horses and a season's worth of hay." A pause. "My wife, she'd been sick already. The shock of it didn't help. She passed that spring." He said it without drama, just as fact, which made it considerably worse. "After that I sold. Didn't have the heart for it anymore." The table was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," Eliza said. "She meant it the way you mean things that don't have adequate words." Garrett looked at her. "Your husband says you've been keeping a record." "Yes." "Of the recent incidents?" "Everything I know of, from when I arrived at the homestead. Rhett has given me the earlier history, and I've recorded that separately, noting that it's from his account rather than direct observation. A judge will want to know the difference." Garrett looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized. The specific recalibration that happens when someone has underestimated you and is revising. "You've done this kind of thing before," he said. "The documentation, the thinking about what a judge wants." "No," she said, "but I've spent most of my life needing to be precise about what I could and couldn't prove. It teaches you certain habits." He was quiet, then, "I'll testify. In person, in front of Harding, whatever he needs." He said it like a door being opened that had been closed for 2 years. "I should have done it before. I know I should have. I was—" He stopped. "I was just done. After my wife. I was done." "You're not done now," Rhett said. Garrett looked at him. "No," he said. "I guess I'm not." Judge Harding arrived in Fenwick on the 14th of January, 3 weeks ahead of his usual schedule, which was its own statement about what Selby's letter had communicated. He was a spare, deliberate man in his 60s, who had the manner of someone who had spent 4 decades sorting through other people's disputed claims, and had developed a comprehensive immunity to being impressed by anyone's presentation of themselves. He met with Rhett and Eliza and Selby for 2 hours on the first afternoon. He read every paper in the tin box. He read Eliza's notebook, slowly, going back to reread certain entries. He asked questions that were precise and occasionally inconvenient, about the chain of evidence, about what they could prove versus what they believed, about the specific wording of Crow's letters, and whether the implied knowledge in them could be argued as something other than direction of criminal acts. Eliza answered what she could answer and said clearly when she couldn't. She'd learned, in the weeks since Fenwick, that Harding's type of intelligence responded better to acknowledged uncertainty than to overclaimed confidence. He was trying to build something that would hold, not something that would sound good. "The fraudulent boundary filing is your strongest material," Harding said, toward the end of the first afternoon. He had the Webb registry letter in front of him, one finger resting on it. "This is documented and verifiable in its county record. The letters from Crow are useful, but they'll be contested. His attorney will argue inference. Garrett's testimony is significant, but he sold willingly in the end, under duress or not, and that complicates the coercion argument." He looked at Eliza across the table. "What happened on your mountain? The men who came up? The incident at the passage? That's the freshest and most directly provable. Do you know those men's names?" "Two of them," Rhett said. "The ones who ride regular for Crow, Duval and a man called Prentice." "Duval," Harding repeated. He wrote it down. "Garrett mentioned that name." "Same man," Eliza said. "I believe so. The scar below the left ear, Rhett described the same." Harding looked at the notebook again. "You noted the date and the time of their arrival, the number of men, the approximate time they spent on your property." "Yes. And you and your husband are prepared to give sworn testimony to everything in here?" "Yes," they both said, at the same moment, without looking at each other. Harding made a sound that was not quite a word, set the notebook down, and said he'd need until morning to complete his review. What happened over the following 3 weeks was not swift or clean. It was the slow, grinding machinery of legal process applied to a situation that had been building for years, and it had the character of all such processes: necessary, exhausting, and frequently maddening in its pace. Harding issued a formal inquiry order, which required Crow to appear before him and produce documents related to his land holdings and the boundary filing. Crow appeared with an attorney from the county seat, and the attorney was good, measured, experienced, knowing exactly which arguments to make and how to frame the documents that existed. But Harding was better, in the particular way that judges who've been doing this for 40 years are better. He knew every move before it was made, and he had Garrett's testimony and Eliza's notebook and the specific internal contradictions in Crow's own letters. And he was patient with all of it in a way that the attorney, used to operating in county courts where Crow's influence had weight, was not prepared for. Judge Fetter, the county judge, was quietly advised that federal inquiries had a way of looking at everything in their path, not just the presenting matter. Fetter developed, abruptly, a prior commitment that kept him unavailable throughout the proceedings. Duval, confronted with Garrett's identification and the potential for criminal charges relating to the fire that had killed Garrett's horses and preceded the death of Garrett's wife, made a decision that men in his position sometimes make when the alternative is a federal charge. He talked. Not everything, not more than he had to, but enough. Enough to establish a direct line between Crow's instructions and the specific acts of harassment and sabotage that had been attributed to parties unknown for 15 years. Crow's attorney tried 3 separate procedural challenges. Harding denied all 3. The boundary filing was ruled fraudulent and invalidated. Crow was ordered to pay restitution for the documented damages to Rhett's property, the water diversion repairs, the cut fences, the equipment, and faced a separate civil proceeding regarding Garrett's barn and the circumstances of the sale. The criminal question of what Duval's testimony implied about Crow's direct knowledge was referred to a federal prosecutor in the territorial capital, a process that would take longer and whose outcome was not guaranteed, but that carried with it the specific gravity of something that couldn't simply be made to go away through local influence. Crow did not speak publicly about any of this. He returned to his ranch and was, by Selby's account, very quiet. They rode back up the mountain in the 3rd week of February, when the worst of the winter had peaked and the snow was still deep, but the days had begun their almost imperceptible lengthening. The North Passage was still blocked. It would be until the spring thaw opened it, as Rhett had said, and they came up by the East Trail, longer but passable. The homestead looked the same as they'd left it, which was both obvious and, after everything, faintly remarkable. The cabin stood, the barn stood, the woodpile under the overhang had shed some of its snow, but was otherwise intact. The frozen creek at the bottom of the cleared field caught the late afternoon light and threw it back up at the sky. Eliza got down from her horse and stood in the yard and looked at all of it. She felt tired in a way that was different from ordinary tired. The specific exhaustion of something long and difficult that has reached its conclusion without quite feeling concluded, because the residue of it is still in your body. She suspected that would take a while to clear. Rhett came and stood beside her. They stood there together looking at the homestead for a moment, not saying anything. "It's still standing," he said finally. "It is," she said. He reached over and put his hand around hers, briefly, not a production of it, just a hand around hers for a moment. Then he went to see to the horses. She stayed in the yard a little longer. The mountains were doing what they always did, just being there, large and permanent and fundamentally uninterested in human events, which she found, as she always found it, more comforting than she could entirely explain. They weren't on her side. They weren't on anyone's side. They were just the truth of the place, the actual reality beneath all the human scrambling over ownership and worth, and who got to decide what a person amounted to. She had come here because she had run out of alternatives. She knew that. She'd never been dishonest with herself about it. But she thought about Dry Creek sometimes, the women outside the milliner's shop, the careful cruelties, the $11. And she thought about what she'd believed about herself in those 3 weeks, what she'd come dangerously close to accepting as permanent, that she was too much of one thing and not enough of another, that her body was a problem, that being alone meant being insufficient. The mountain had not told her differently. The mountain hadn't told her anything. What had told her differently was the daily experience of finding out what she was capable of, not in some grand revelatory moment, but in the accumulated evidence of days, replacing a rope with the right knot, reading a weather change, keeping records that held up in front of a federal judge, going left, hard left, when the shelf came down, and staying there. Worth isn't assigned, she thought, not by towns, not by men who need to believe in the categories they've built. It isn't waiting in some other person's recognition, either. She'd learned that the hard way, in Millhaven, with a man who'd called letting her go the practical choice. Worth is the thing you keep discovering you have, in situations that demand it. You don't find it in the places that already know your name. You find it in the places that have never heard of you, that don't care what you look like or where you came from, that simply present you with what needs doing and wait to see what you'll do. She went inside and started on a fire. Spring came in fits and starts, the way it does in mountain country. A warm week in March that made you believe, followed by a late snowfall that reminded you this terrain made its own schedule. The North Passage cleared in mid-April, water running loud through it where the shale fall had compressed the creek bed into a new course. Rhett walked it with her when it opened, both of them picking their way through the aftermath, and it was strange to walk through it in daylight and warmth, the whole geography rearranged from what she'd known in the dark and cold. "Looks different," she said. "Usually does," he said. "After." She stopped and looked up at the exposed rock face where the shelf had been. The raw stone was gray and clean, the kind of gray that would take years to weather back to something that looked like it belonged. "You know what I keep thinking about?" she said. "Tell me." "That I almost didn't come," she said. "Up here, with you. I almost decided not to." She wasn't looking for anything from this admission, just saying it aloud because it was true. "I was sitting in that room at Mrs. Pyle's with $11 and a cousin in Abilene who probably couldn't help me, and I almost convinced myself the sensible thing was to take the stage back and try somewhere else." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "What changed your mind?" She thought about it honestly. "Nothing changed my mind exactly. I looked at the options and this one was the only one that was real. The others were just variations on what had already not worked." She paused. "That's not a very romantic answer." "No," he said. "It's an honest one." She looked at him, standing in the opened passage with the spring light on his face, this large, serious, profoundly unornamental man who had pointed at her across a square in Dry Creek and said her. Only her. She had wondered about that choice for months, turned it over, looked at it from different angles. She thought she understood it now, or at least understood one version of it. He had recognized something in her that she hadn't yet recognized in herself. Not the fullness of it, not all at once. Not a certainty. Just a quality. The quality of someone who would not collapse. "Rhett," she said. "Yeah. I'm glad I came." He looked at her the way he looked at things he valued. Directly, without performance, without trying to make the moment into more than it was. "So am I," he said. They walked back out of the passage together into the open country, the cleared field below them and the cabin beyond it and the mountains around everything, holding their positions as they always had. In June, 2 families came up from Fenwick, the Aldrich family and a couple named Bauer, who had been looking for land in the territory, to see about homesteading parcels on the eastern slope that Rhett knew to be unclaimed. He'd mentioned to Selby that the land was good, and Selby had mentioned it to the right people. And now there were people on the trail who hadn't been there before. Eliza fed them all at the long table Rhett had built that winter, an addition she'd asked for and he'd built without making a thing of it, wider than the old one, and solid as the rest of what he built. 8 people around it, crowded but warm, the kind of meal where conversation runs across itself and the food disappears faster than you expected. The Aldrich boy, maybe 13, asked Rhett how long the homestead had been there, and Rhett said 17 years, and the boy looked around at the cabin and the barn and the cleared field as if 17 years were almost incomprehensibly long, which Eliza supposed it was, at 13. "Who built all of it?" the boy asked. "I did," Rhett said. "First part. Eliza's done a fair amount of the recent work." The boy looked at her with the frank curiosity of someone who hasn't yet learned to disguise his assessments. "You built things?" "I learned to," she said. "What things?" She thought about it. Rechinked the north wall last fall, replaced the well rope, helped rebuild the water diversion upstream twice, set fence posts on the east boundary. She paused. Led some men into a mountain passage and held my position while a rock shelf came down across the trail. The boy stared at her. Rhett, across the table, was looking at his plate with an expression she recognized as him suppressing something. "She's not telling it to impress you," Selby said, from down the table, with a completely straight face. "That's just what happened." The dinner went on. The evening went on. People talked about land and water rights and the coming summer, and the question of whether the rail spur would actually come through like everyone kept saying. And Eliza moved between the table and the stove and came back again, and at some point she looked around at the room, full of light and noise, and people who had come here because someone had told them this mountain was worth something, and felt the specific, uncomplicated satisfaction of something that has become real. Not perfect. The civil proceeding against Crow was still grinding through the system and would be for years. The cut on Rhett's hand from the shale had healed badly on one side and gave him trouble in cold weather. The cabin needed work on the east-facing roof before next winter. There were 100 things unresolved and 100 more that would go wrong in ways they couldn't predict. But real. Genuinely, solidly real. Later, after everyone had gone, after the Aldriches and the Bowers had made their way back down to Fenwick for the night and Selby had gone with them, Eliza washed the dishes and Rhett dried them, a division of labor that had arrived gradually and established itself without discussion. And when the last dish was put away, he leaned against the counter and looked at her. "You told that kid you led men into a mountain passage," he said. "I did," she said. "You've never said it that plainly before." She thought about this. "No," she said. "I haven't." She hadn't, she realized, because some part of her had still been holding back from claiming it fully. From saying, "Yes, I did that, it was real, it counted." The habit of diminishment runs deep in people who've had it practiced on them long enough. You start to diminish yourself before anyone else gets the chance. She was done with that. The evening was quiet around the cabin, the mountain country doing its enormous indifferent thing outside the walls, the fire settling into its coals. Rhett put his hand on the back of her neck for a moment, easy and warm, and she leaned into it slightly, and that was the whole of the tenderness, which was enough. Some things you earn by staying, not by being chosen, not by being seen from across a square by someone who recognized something in you before you did. Though that matters, that kind of recognition is not nothing. But the deeper earning is in the days that follow, in the rope replaced with the right knot, in the record kept, in the position held. The woman nobody wanted had found the one place that required everything she had, and had found out, in the requiring, that everything she had was considerable. That was not a small thing. Outside, the summer dark came down over the Black Ridge Mountains, and the homestead sat in it, lit from within, standing on ground that was nobody's but theirs.